plane goes over, we're all in the desert, the plane comes over, I thought, okay, fine, everyone's watching it. And then it lands, and there's a sort of a journalist, they're all, not lands, it's sort of, we see a dust go off in the distance. All these journalists are high-fiving each other. I'm thinking, where has that landed? That didn't look right. And I get a call from the cameraman saying they missed it. They missed the target area. We've graded a runway into the desert. We've got all these slow-mo cameras and everything all aligned it. He's missed it by 2 kilometers.
Sanjay, as the title says, you sort of specialise in making those programmes that are impossible. Quite often commissioners will say, give us something brave, give us something risky, give us something we can't make. And most of us roll our eyes, but you leave the meeting and you do it. Tell us about Plane Crash and kind of how that came about. I know you joined production partway through at Dragonfly, but tell us how the idea was born, first of all.
As you say, I joined Dragonfly, which is the company which made Plane Crash. And at that stage, this production was already partly underway. It had come about as a result of, I think, an interesting meeting with a chap called Jeff Dean, who's a producer and has been producing films for many, many years, particularly I think in this sort of science and special factual field. And he had a meeting with David Glover, who was then a commissioning editor at Channel 4 in the special factual department. And it's quite hard to get David's attention. It certainly was back in those days when you were trying to pitch him ideas. So the more outlandish the idea, the better. And they took in a list of titles, effectively, to sort of say, well, which one do you like? And he scanned through the list, probably about 20 titles on the list. And there were 2 words that caught his attention. They just said Plane Crash. He circled that. He said, that's the one I'd like. No idea at that stage whether it could be made or what even it would be. But he just liked the idea of it. And Jeff then took that away. Jeff went away and sort of then decided to flesh out whether indeed that could be made and for what reason, and came back with a set of US Navy test pilots or former pilots who were confident that they could find a way in which they could safely crash a commercial airliner for the first time. And that was then taken back to Channel 4, who then formally commissioned the program and asked him to make it with a bigger company, which was Dragonfly.
And so when you came on board, there was a production team in place and some of the planning had started. But how do you even begin to start planning for something that ambitious / crazy?
Well, I think what basically happened with that production was there was a good and bad in the early stages. So the good was there was a sort of willingness and desire and drive to just get up and running and get this plane crashed. So obviously the first port of call was, well, can we buy a plane? How much is that going to cost? This is an expensive documentary, but at the same time, this is a massive plane we're trying to buy. So they found there are these sort of effectively plane graveyards. You can go and buy planes like you can go and buy secondhand cars, it turns out. And so, but we wanted a plane that was pretty shit, that would get the job done, get in the air, be big enough. So they went and found a plane. Everyone at that stage wanted a double R plane. So i.e. you had that sort of extra width, a proper sort of transatlantic style flight. They went and looked, I think it was a DC-10. The problem was they were going to buy it, and then they suddenly realized at the last minute somebody discovered that in the tips of the wings of the DC-10, they have depleted uranium. I don't know why. I think it's something to do with the weight distribution on the wings or something. It was then decided against that because it was felt that obviously you couldn't crash a plane and then create a scenario where you had radioactive material, even if it's depleted, left on the wasteland. The bottom line was, Donna, that when I took over the company, which is a few months after this project had started, it felt to me that, and this was my key learning with that project and with other projects, was that the mistake with these really complex productions is to sort of think of them as television productions. They're sort of not. And it's true of Plane Crash, it's also true of The British Drive Next Door, which we'll talk about later, which is I felt that you've got a massive exercise in that program of aviation project management to do first. And only when you've done that, do you bring on board a production team. And so, for instance, in that case, we had a team trying to work out how we'd crash the plane and how it'd be possible to get the permissions and insurance and so on. Meanwhile, we had a production team trying to work out what we make. But they were effectively, we were burning through money while that team were on board because there was no plan in place. So what I did when I took over was I shut the production down, suspended everyone on that production for the long term. And for the next 3 years, we had to figure out how we could actually get it off, literally get it off the ground. And so I think my learning from that was, with these big complex projects, treat them like a project management exercise first, which is logistics and technical and legal. And only when you've solved all of those problems with the bringing different experts in those fields, do you then start to bring in the creative and production management team to help you actually get the production off the ground.
Sanjay, I think your shows, one of the hallmarks of your shows is they always have brilliant pre-titles. Did you, right at the start of this project, did you have a vision in your head of what these pre-titles should look like? Was that how you were selling the show?
No, sadly not. By the way, don't forget, I didn't sell that show. That was Jeff Dean who sold the show, and it was in production before I joined. But no, sadly, Donna, it was a funny thing, actually. You know, you have to get like EdSpec signed off and everything just on that program. Not only was the pre-title not conceived of or done until about week 25, the EdSpec wasn't signed off until about week 23, and we'd been in production on it for 4 years. But no, I'd say, no, the pre-title was a real endeavor, and you know, hopefully we got it right in the end. But even like, do you show any of the crash? Does that give away the ending? How much of the science are you showing within the program? No, but in answer to your question, no, we didn't have any idea what the pre-title would say before we got into about month 4 of the edit.
And there's a good question from Charlotte Wasserman in the audience. Hi, Charlotte. Obviously, that was a 4-year project, but how long was it in development for? And how do you get Channel to sort of fund that level of development? Do you know how long it was in development for?
I think it was in development for, I'm thinking it was in development for about 9 months or so. I think what you'll certainly find with the channels is that they will put significant money into very big scale productions that are channel defining. We've had that time and time again. Certainly before I joined Dragonfly, the same thing had happened with The Family, which had been an incredibly expensive development, eye-watering sums of money. And that was because Nick Cohen and Magnus Temple at the time were trying to create the very first rig in a family home, and are using the Big Brother technology to go somewhere else. And I think the channel, whenever the channel feels, I think every channel, when they feel that they're onto something that could be genre defining, genre changing, I think they will find the money. So there's a lot of money put into that at the time. And I think that money was used effectively, as I said, from that meeting with David Glover on the plane crash, to sort of say, is this even feasible? Can this be done? And if so, how can it be done? And that's what they came back with, a plan where they found this outfit in America called Broken Wing. And Broken Wing were full of former US test pilots, Navy test pilots. They also did a lot of stunt work in movies. So they had a combination of real kind of proper military flying experience, plus the understanding of the entertainment business, if you like. And the combination of those two things meant that they were able to come together and sort of think and say, yes, there will be a way we can do this, and there will be a system we can use. And bear in mind, it was a very high hurdle to cross, because the only people who had ever tried to do this before we tried it were NASA. And NASA had tried to do this in the 80s, and they were doing it because they wanted to crash a plane to test some anti-fire materials that they wanted to put on board their military, their sort of jets. And they ran something like 200 different test flights. And when they ran it for months and months and months, had much, much greater budget than we had. And they screwed it up. They actually completely destroyed the plane on impact. And it was a complete write-off. So the barriers were very high, because we were entering into a world where we knew that the only people who had ever tried it and unsuccessfully were NASA. So you sort of felt, okay, that's a high bar to get over. Although, to be fair, that was had been a long time before.
So bearing that in mind and everything else that's going on over those 4 years, what was it that really kept you awake at night?
I think everything. Bear in mind, just from a personal perspective, I suppose I just started running this company. I'd taken over, and I really had no idea how to run a company at all. And then suddenly, within running a company, you then had this kind of crazy project, which was hemorrhaging money. So there were many different things. One is it was one of the probably the first really high risk project in that way, where actually there was life risk associated with it, because people could die if you made the wrong decisions. It was a very dangerous project. It was very high risk financially, because you could literally put the company out of business if you get that wrong, with the overspends and the finances involved. But at the same time, creatively, you're thinking, well, I want to be able to do this. There were definitely times, Donna, where I wanted it all to go away. And the problem we were in, and I probably shouldn't speak too openly, but between us, my philosophy was quite simple, which was I wanted the project killed because I could see a world of pain ahead of me, financial and every other way, and I couldn't work out how we were going to do it. I knew technically how we could do it, but we had no permission from any country. Every country in the world, America, everyone was saying, hang on a minute, you want to come here, take a plane, fly it above a crowded area and then crash it. For what reason? You must be joking, we're not going to allow it. And no one was playing ball for some reason. And so, but the thing is, if I had turned around to Discovery or Nat Geo at the time, and Channel 4 and ProSieben in Germany, our co-production partners, put up a lot of money and said, I don't want to do this, they would have said, okay, here's the bill. And we'd have had to pay them back all the money and we'd have gone under. So my tactic at the time had been to say, look, why don't I sort of make it your decisions? I'm going to put forward all the problems why it is really, really tricky and why it's not a good idea to do it. You kill it. You put a bullet in it for me. And that guy, David Glover, I mentioned earlier, I mean, he was both brilliant and intensely annoying, because he was brilliant in the sense that he had the vision and the aspiration to just get it done, and the tenacity and sheer blooded mindedness to keep it on track. Annoying because he wouldn't kill it. And he just wouldn't put a bullet on the show when I needed it to, because he kept thinking we could make it. He proved right in the end. He was absolutely right to go with it. But I was hoping someone would kill the program, they wouldn't kill it.
So, and I get that, like I'm still sweating about it now, just sitting here. How the hell do you put an insurance package together and a risk assessment together for something like this?
Well, that's a good question. Not very easily. But if you go through the steps you've got, you've bought a plane, you've got rid of the one with radioactive materials in its wings, you found another one that just about works, you park that for 2 or 3 years while you're trying to find a country that'll let you crash the plane, and we've gone around the world looking at different options, including Britain and America. We finally get the permission of Mexico. And then it's like, oh yeah, we'll just get the insurance. We'd phone up the insurance company and say, hey, this is fine. We're going to crash this plane. We don't want any money for it. When we crash it, it's decimated. That's fine, but we don't need any money for that. We just need to cover the risk while we're flying it. So they were like, hang on, let's get this straight. You're going to take a plane from an airport. You're going to fly above a crowded area, and then it's going to, for a period of time, have no one on board the plane. So you're going to have a massive plane in the air above a populated area with no one flying it. And they said, not a chance will we insure that program. And we suddenly realized, actually something we probably should have realized quite early, it was an insane ask. Which insurance company would ever insure that risk? They would go nowhere near it. So that looked like project jeopardizing at some stage. But I have to say there was one benefit of working, there was a big benefit of working at that stage within what was Shine Group. Shine Group had recently bought by News Corporation. And News Corporation are obviously a huge company, and they have their own internal risk assessment, internal insurance backing. So News Corporation underwrote the program. Without that, I think we'd have been screwed. So in a nutshell, we couldn't get insurance. We could only get insurance because it's underwritten by a giant multi-billion-dollar company.
And how do you keep a team going in those circumstances? Because you're feeling the fear, they must be feeling the fear. How do you lead from the front, being honest and authentic, but being true to all that's going on? How do you keep a team resilient during? It must have been very snakes and ladders, very up and down, and very scary when it got to the moment of filming. How do you lead a team like that?
So Donna, bear in mind that there'd been a big hiatus where there was no team, because it was being run as a project management exercise with people like the test pilots I mentioned in America, scientists that we're bringing on board to help with planning what the science would be, and industry experts and so on, and production management within Dragonfly. we didn't have an editorial team. When we got the permission, we then hired at speed, and we were then up on the clock because the Mexican authorities had given us a very strict deadline to go to crash the plane by, and it wasn't very long. I think from memory, by the time we got it formally through and got the insurance policy and everything else, we had 7 weeks. So actually we had 7 weeks. In fact, at that stage, it was just, the thing wasn't at that stage about trying to keep everyone's spirit going. It was like trying to ensure that everyone understood we have got heaven and earth to move. We've got the most expensive television documentary ever made. We've got perhaps the biggest logistical exercise ever undertaken in a single documentary. And we've got 7 weeks to get our shit together. And so that meant corralling a number of people and trying to compartmentalize what their individual responsibilities were and try to ensure they understood there was no margin for error, and how important it was that everyone's going to be communicating together at the same time. Production management, editorial, science production, health and safety. So that was pretty arduous. And in that sense, what we did there was, Dragonfly was a medium-sized company. We effectively just mothballed the whole thing just to make this program. Everyone, every member of senior management, every member of the team just stopped what they were doing, including me, and we only focused on this production. 7 weeks to get to Mexico, and then 2 weeks from Mexico to crash the plane.
And can you talk me through the last 2 or 3 days, quite literally before takeoff? Tell me what was happening in those last 2 or 3 days and on the day of filming.
Well, as you'll appreciate, again, Donna, it was still this thing that we were trying to run this as both how are we going to do it and how do we film it? And so there were a couple of really big calls that came up at that time. Bear in mind, we are now in, I can't remember the name of the desert. I should remember the name of the desert, but it was near Mexicali and in northern Mexico. And basically the Mexican authorities had given permission because they thought it'd be a really good opportunity to test their emergency service response to a disaster like this happening. So they thought, well, great, you crash the plane. We will use it to test our fire response, our military response, our police response to an event like that. So as a result of which, we had the Mexican army, the Mexican police, the entire fire brigade, all at our disposal. They sealed off the entire area. They were all there to be disposed. So we had an enormous number of people on location. I think, hundreds basically around this desert where the plane was going to crash. But the problem was the pilots were still trying to, because this was the only real-time testing they had of the plane. They'd never actually had the plane, they'd never flown the plane yet. So every day the pilots were trying to test the equipment. They bought, I thought on a test like this, given what I said about NASA and everything else, that there'd be something extraordinarily high tech. They used a remote control device, plastic remote control device that they bought from Radio Shack in America, which is just a little sort of like, not quite DIY store, but I'm sure people know what it is. And it's almost used for like model aeroplane type of stuff, like toys. And they adapted that to try to remote control the plane. So the idea was, really simply without going to the whole program, the idea was the crew would take off the plane was loaded with science equipment, crash test dummies, etc. They would fly the plane, followed by a small chaser plane that was trying desperately to keep up. And at a certain stage, the chaser plane would take over control of this plane using a remote control from like 100 feet away. That's what you'd have seen in the clip, the tiny little plane behind it. The pilots and the crew would then parachute out of the back of the plane. And by the way, that was one of the reasons we chose that plane, because if you parachute out of the normal entrances we get on the plane we go on, you get sucked into the engine. So you had to find a plane where you could go out the back behind the engine. They'd parachute out the back at a very low height. And then what would happen is the remote control would take over and they'd guide it in. The problem was the remote control and the satellite navigation systems were just not working well enough. And so they were not hitting the zone close enough, or not, they weren't predicting they could hit the zone, where we've got an array of £1 million worth of cameras. So that was all really, really, really stressful. And then the night before we were meant to crash the plane, the pilots turned around and said, I'm sorry, it's just, we've got nowhere near the precision. We're not going to hit the zone. And not worse than that, you're going to have to clear everyone out for a 5-kilometre radius. So that means all the cameramen, all the fire engines, everyone's gone. I thought, well, what's the point of crashing this plane if we can't film it? So that was a pretty bad night, because then we had to get up in the morning, 4:30, and persuade a bunch of pretty hardened US test Navy pilots to not do what they were insistent they were going to do. It bought us another day. That was then the Friday. That was then the day the permit ran out. So I knew if we didn't do it that day, we would go home humiliated because there would be no crash. And so you're under a lot of pressure because you burnt all the money by then. So if you don't crash the plane on that day, you're finished. Luckily, the weather was okay. Luckily, everything took off. And then, of course, what happened, Donna, was a plane goes over. We're all in the desert. The plane comes over. I thought, okay, fine. Everyone's watching it. And then it lands. And there's a sort of a journalist. They're all not lands. It's sort of, we see a dust go off in the distance. Well, these journalists are high-fiving each other. I'm thinking, where has that landed? That didn't look right. And I get a call from the cameraman saying they missed it. They missed the target area. We've graded a runway into the desert. We've got all these slow-mo cameras and everything all aligned it. He's missed it by 2 kilometers, right? 2 kilometers. That means all of those cameras, not one of them has filmed it. So while everyone's high-fiving, I'm thinking, oh my God, we've just conducted the world's most extraordinary plane crash without a single shot of it. And so that wasn't a great moment. The only hope we had was that we'd hired a helicopter the day before, and the helicopter was meant to track along the runway as it kind of crashed. And the helicopter, the cameraman was leaning right out of the door and at maximum reach and maximum angle, and was sticking the camera out to try and film it. And the helicopter landed about half an hour later. We ran over and said, "Did you get it? Did you get it?" He said, "Don't worry, I got it." So that was it. So it was basically, we nearly didn't do it. And then when we did do it, we missed it. And we nearly didn't film anything. So you can imagine that was not a good moment.
Even talking about it now stresses me out still. What were the cameras? There's a question from the floor. What were the cameras, even though they didn't capture it in the end, but what was the camera setup that you had?
Well, along the runway, every camera you could think of. We had the super slow-mos, they called Alexas, I don't know, but we had the super slow-mo that they use at places like Wimbledon and stuff, so we could have done in painstaking detail the slow-mo of the crash. All of that gone, so we don't have that in the footage. We had, sort of movie-grade cameras, Reds and whatever else, and then we also then had a huge number of GoPro cameras all along the runway to pick up every conceivable angle. Then obviously we had, I guess, a standard sort of digital camera that was off the back of that was in the helicopter. We had a camera that we put onto a plane that was flying above the 727. And at the last minute, we just stuck a GoPro on the bottom of that so that it could get an overhead shot, which was lucky. And the only other thing was then the really challenging thing was we had to capture all the science on board the plane. So we had a number of cameras in the plane, but the problem was they couldn't film all the time because they had limited memory. So we needed them to start filming only when there was impact. So there was a lot of technical equipment worked on with the scientists, which is how do you get cameras to start recording when the first tremor of impact is felt, because they could only record for, I think, about 20 or 30 seconds. And then, by the way, the only other thing was we had to get those cameras off the plane within 3 hours, or the memory would go. So that means when the plane was on fire, we had to get the fire brigade in quickly, put the fire out, get on the plane, and scientists are scrabbling around the plane to retrieve all the cameras on board. Otherwise, all the science would have been lost. So even when we crashed it, there was still pretty hard work to be done by the team.
And clearly it's great telly, and clearly the title's irresistible, but there has to be a purpose and a why to every show. So what was the why to this show?
I think the why to this show was, I think it was a really straightforward proposition from the beginning, which was and that was worked out with all the scientists and illustrious scientists and air crash investigators that we spoke to at MIT and many other institutions. And that was that if you think about the work of most of the people and specialists in this field, they get to an air crash after it's happened. And so they assess the damage that's been done, but they've never been able to rig and test a plane crash as it's happening. And I think that there's a wealth of scientific data that you get about everything from stress gauging the plane to understanding what happens Does the brace position work? What happens if you change the brace position of the plane? These are not things you're going to suddenly turn around if a plane is crashing. The steward's not going to turn around and say, right, half of the plane, could you please lean forward and the other half do something else? That's not going to happen. So we were able to test and model different things in accordance with what scientists wanted to test, because the bottom line being they could test it as it was happening rather than after it happened.
Makes total sense. You've alluded to it being one of the most expensive docs ever. Are you happy or able to say how much it did cost?
Hundreds of dollars.
Hundreds of dollars, quite a few hundreds of dollars. Okay, all right, we'll leave it there. Really good question from Elliot Swinburne. Hi, Elliot. Elliot says, when you're putting a team together, and we know that the team came on later, but when you are putting a team together, the team's critical, isn't it? What were you looking for in that team, and what are you generally looking for when you're building a team?
Well, it's a great question. I think on that specific project, it was really, really hard to figure out what exactly we needed, because in a sense, normally what I like to have in a team is somebody who will be command and control day-to-day, overall responsibility for the production, your conventional sort of series producer, series director figure who then would report into an exec. I think it was slightly impossible to achieve that here because we had so much history, and I obviously co-exec this production with Simon Dixon, so both of us were running the program together in the run-up to and on location. And so both of us had built, and Steve Nam, who's my business partner, who'd done a lot of the legal and compliance work and the permissions work. And so we had so much shared history that it was really hard to give all that over to somebody. So in this particular case, it became very exec heavy. And actually what we then needed was to have people who could do specific roles. So I needed as a science producer, I needed somebody who could just look after the science on the program and work with the scientists to ensure that their experiments. I needed somebody who could look after how are we going to film the crash. So we hired an American producer called Ryan Center, and Ryan's brilliant call was actually to persuade us all that we had to have a helicopter, and that because he couldn't guarantee getting the crash if it missed the site. And that was a fantastic call in the end, best $10,000 we've ever spent. And then we needed another producer, Richard, who was basically looking after the kind of day-to-day, like what is going on with the sort of broad storytelling, with the scientists prepping, the pilots prepping for the show. So fundamentally, there were many different people who had distinct responsibilities who all then reported into what we effectively grandly and pompously called Gold Command, which is me and Simon, who were basically running the show and taking briefs from all these different departments, including health and safety and so on. Very quickly answer the question about what I'm generally looking for. I think it does vary project to project. You know, if you're making a single film, you're looking for someone with, I hope, some sort of creative vision and directorial flair or something that's going to bring that to the table. If you're trying to make something that's, practically very, very difficult, you're looking for someone who I think can reassure you that they understand the complex logistical arrangements. They may not be responsible for fixing them, but you want someone who's not going to ignore all of that and is also going to be able to work very closely with the production management team to accomplish that.
And you just mentioned the production management team. I mean, any good production is a blend between editorial and production management. How critical is that relationship and your production management team on a program like this?
We've always tried to work, both at Dragonfly and at Voltage, which is company on our run, we've always tried to work completely seamlessly hand in glove. So an incredibly brilliant head of production, Amanda Hibbets, who was in fact production manager, line producer on the plane crash, has worked with me on all the very difficult programs we've made, right back through to even shows like Kill It, Cook It, Eat It, or The Hotel, which is at that stage the biggest rig that have been done. And I think these shows only work. In fact, all of our programs only work if there's real tight communication from the very beginning. So from the very beginning, everything's joined up between production exec and exec producer. They talk all the way through. Budgets are really transparent. So series producers come aboard and give an exact one, but there's no hiding or any of that. We try to empower people to make those decisions and say, okay, here's the budget. If you want to move it around, just talk to each other and work that out. And I think so. I think the thing is, it's easily said, and I think a lot of people say they do it, and I'm not sure everyone does do it, but I think we definitely have the feeling that from the very top of the company, and people have, from the very top of the company, we try to work hand in glove between editorial and production management. And hopefully what that does then, it means it filters all the way down through the team. So that, because I sort of think there cannot be a them and us. There cannot be a scenario where it's like, no, you can't achieve that. Everyone wants to achieve the same thing here, whether you're in production management, whether you're directing. You both want to be proud of the program you make together, and you want to sort of think that, look, wow, look, we did this. It's not an editorial achievement, it is a team achievement. So therefore, I think that's the spirit we try to instill.
Brilliant. And there's one last question from the floor. So you've been honest and said the helicopter was quite a last minute inclusion. Before the helicopter, what was your contingency plan then if the plane missed the crash landing spot?
Didn't have one.
Didn't have one. Okay.
We didn't have one. We were, to coin a phrase, we were flying by the seat of our pants for this production. It was unlike, sometimes, you have a bit of luck on your side. That on that occasion, we had a bit of luck on our side. And I remember in the evening where we sat in a hotel room that evening with the commissioners, and we didn't know this, but the data wranglers were going through all the tapes, and they were putting through every single tape. There was like nothing on it, no plane crash, and they were sort of just completely panicking. We were in the next room drinking champagne, the execs, the commissioner, just thinking, oh no, it's all done, it's great, the cameraman told us he's filmed it. And they were just looking through, they had nothing on tape after tape, and suddenly they put in a tape and they thought, oh my God, there it is, there's the shot. So, in answer to your question, I don't know, I think we didn't really have a plan. We took it, we trusted the pilots were going to say what they were going to deliver what they said they would do, which is get it on the runway. It didn't cross our minds that they would miss by 2 kilometers. We had a margin of error, which is, well, if they missed by 100 kilometers, we'll get it this way. They missed by 100 meters, they missed by 200 meters, the GoPros will get it. We had another camera on the side of the road. To miss by 2 kilometers, I'm not criticizing them. It's like, it was a really incredibly hard task to achieve. But no, we'd have come back with a lot of built up and absolutely no crash. And I think, I remember a friend of ours, actually Dan Adamson, who's at 2-4. I worked with him on The Apprentice many years ago, 15 years ago. And we were trying to find a house for the apprentices to live in. We couldn't find a house. And we were right up against the shoot. And you imagine, you can't make The Apprentice without a house. And Dan said to us, if you don't find a house, none of us will ever work in television again. We'll be the laughing stock of the industry. I thought he's got a point. We just literally went door to door and just started knocking on everyone's houses to get it. And we found a house, and he was right. And I did feel there that it was unthinkable that we couldn't film that plane. I just don't even want to go there, Donna. It would have been like, I would have left television and I wouldn't be doing this masterclass. I'd have been, I'd have moved abroad, emigrated and changed my name, gone in witness protection. It would have been just too humiliating, too embarrassing. Don't even go there. Don't ask me about it.
And just the last couple of questions. Do you think that scale of show could still be made? There's lots of talk of commissioners being really risk adverse now. Do you think anyone would have the balls to make that show now?
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree that commissioners are risk averse. Actually, I think they do place risky bets, and I think it's a tough job, and I think they are trying to, in different forms, not necessarily as high risk. Risk is different. There's many different manifestations of risk, aren't there? This is risky because there's a lot of money. It was a project that might not have executed, and it actually involved proper physical risk, as in there was risk to the people on board the plane, there was risk to the people in the surrounding environment. That's the bit I started to feel uncomfortable with by the end, that I think we minimized all of that as much as we could. But there was a moment, Donna, where, and I'll quite answer your question, but there's a moment where the pilot's meant to jump out at, I can't remember what we agreed, sort of 3,000 feet. We had the best parachutist, most experienced parachutist in America, who was on board the plane to make sure the pilot got out at the end. They were meant to go together. We had very tight protocols for all this, which they then decided to ignore at the last minute. So we knew they were going to light a flare as they jump out of the plane. We were watching for that flare because we know that they're out and we know that they're safe. but then the allotted time came and he just didn't jump out. And he didn't jump out because he was being so professional about it that he wanted to take the plane as low as it could get to ensure they would try and hit the target. So, and all that time I'm thinking, what if he's fallen over? What if he's running out the plane and he's fallen over and injured his leg? And then, you know, you've got a situation where a guy on board is going to like be on a plane that's crashing. So we had protocols to deal with that. But I think for me, I felt that I sort of certainly don't want to go down a route again where I'm looking at programs that involve any degree of risk like that, because I don't feel comfortable with it. And I think the television industry went a bit mad with that sort of thing after plane crash, actually. And they were putting people, I think, at risk, even though they said they weren't. But in answer to your question, I do think commissioners will have that appetite for making big, risky programs. I still think they do it. I just think the money is a lot tighter. And I guess it's like about whether the broadcasters who can take that risk are in different places now.
And so you did get the crash and the industry didn't have to lose you and Dicko. And you went on to critical acclaim and bagged yourself a handful of awards. But has it sort of been a bit of a noose around your neck now? When you go into meetings, are people just going, give us another plane crash, give us another plane crash?
They did for a while, but I think, yeah, a little bit, but not as much. Donna, what happened was as soon as I made Plane Crash, I quit Voltage. So I delivered the show, and then I stood down running Voltage and started running Dragonfly. Took 6 months off, and then basically started Voltage. And of course, when you're starting a brand new small indie from scratch, no one is necessarily coming to you and saying, right, you know, we want the biggest show on television or whatever. So I think we benefited from not having that, you know, starting again. But I do think it is a problem for people. I remember when we used to make Kill It, Cook It, Eat It, which is a very different sort of show. But the problem was, Kill It, Cook It, Eat It was where we built, we took an abattoir, ripped out all the walls, replaced them with glass, and then built a restaurant on the side of the abattoir, and diners had to watch animals being killed before they could eat them. And the thing was, it was quite noisy and provocative at the time. But at that stage, every meeting we went into is like, yeah, that's all fine. We can get that from other companies. Where's our Kill It, Cook It, Eat It? And I said, we need something just to pay the rent, guys. You know, these are hard ideas to come up with. They're really hard to execute. They're not going to have them every 5 minutes. So I do think it can be a problem. You can become a bit typecast as that kind of producer. But thankfully, it didn't happen to me. And hopefully it just happened to my successors at Dragonfly instead.
So let's go on and talk about, you set up Voltage. You're still quite a newish indie and independent, and the British Tribe Next Door. How was that born?
So the British Tribe Next Door came actually from many years ago from an idea that we were in a development brainstorm, and somebody had said, one of the producers in the team had sort of said, what if we just built a house in the middle of the jungle? And we thought, that's an exciting idea. But then we sort of pitched it straight away. But the problem was there was zero purpose behind it. I mean, like, we thought, what a great visual, like take a barrack home and literally rebuild it brick by brick in the middle of, you know, wherever, the Amazon or something. And we thought it'd have a sort of environmental thing to it. You know, they got their washing machine and blah, blah, blah. But everyone said why, and we couldn't really think of a why. So basically, it just sort of percolated away for ages and ages. And I think that often happens. I think it's one only piece of advice I would give is that I think some of the ideas that we have managed to land, and some of the ideas I felt proudest of, have been ideas that they didn't go straight away, that they needed time, and they needed something else to fuse with them. Not just that you repitch the same old ideas, but something else happens, something changes, and you kind of think of those ideas in a slightly different way. And I'm really surprised by how many of the ideas we've got commissioned have had exactly that happen to it. And so basically with that particular thing, I've read a book called Sapiens. I'm sure many people have read it. It's sort of international bestseller about the sort of story of mankind, effectively. And in reading that book and reading about, I suppose, not quite the evolution of society, but in some way the development of society, it sort of struck me, well, hang on, is this the purpose? That actually nowadays we have sort of two very different, or many different ways of living. But if you look at a Western modern way of living against a sort of more indigenous tribal way of living, we're sort of, they've made a deliberate decision to live like that in the 21st century, and they're following the traditions and the ways of living that might well have been the case, maybe even thousands of years ago, deliberately, not quite because they're mobile phones and so on, but largely the cultural tradition is the same. And so I just felt, by reading that book, it made me feel, okay, is this the purpose, that actually we put that house and a family into the middle of a tribal society? And then what we can then do is sort of look at two very viable ways of living in the 21st century and see what we can learn from each other. But that would involve taking a British home effectively and rebuilding it from scratch in the middle of an indigenous village.
So Sanjay, once you got the commission from Channel 4 for that, what was put in place to make sure it was made in the most ethical way?
So we worked right from the beginning. So right from the beginning, we had exec producer Dom Walker on it, and Dom has made some challenging and difficult and ethically chewy programs over the years, so fully understands a lot of the issues, as I hope most of the team would have done. But for instance, she'd made Jamie's School Dinners years ago, being Channel 4 commissioning editor, worked on Lisbon and Drowning in Plastics, studied anthropology at university. So there was a sort of sensitivity built in right from the very process with the people that we were hiring to make the program. Dom had spoken to leading anthropologists, and that was one of our first starting points, both here and in Namibia, actually. And in other countries when we were looking at other places other than Namibia to start with, to make sure that we had buy-in from those people, not only buy-in, not a sort of back-covering exercise, but actually understood from them what are the steps we should be putting in from the very beginning to make sure this is ethically responsible. Because the last thing we want to do, at the end of the day, it's only television. We don't want to do anything that's going to create damage or social harm to people. It's just not worth it, clearly. So therefore, everything we were putting in place was done in order to ensure that we were trying to do best practice. And we took on board a lot of different things there, because, when you go and meet the villagers, Jemi in Namibia, they have not only do they have no electricity or television or anything else, a lot of the villagers don't know what a television is. There is a television in the local town, which is about I can't remember, sort of 3 or 4 about 4-hour drive away. But most of them don't go to that local town, and the reality is they don't engage with television. So when you're trying to say to them that we are trying to make a television program, well, you consent to being in television. What does that mean? When they don't know what Britain is, what a television set is, what Channel 4 is, what consent in that way means. So all of those things were stepped through every single detail about how do we explain these things in a way that will make sense and be relative and understandable? How do we get informed consent? How do we ensure that our footprint is limited? How do we ensure that our impact is minimal? Those are things that were built in from the very beginning of the process and are important to the production.
Yeah. And how do you go about getting access with that tribe? How did you decide on that tribe, and then how did you get the access?
To decide on that tribe, we had previously looked at other countries as well. We looked at Papua New Guinea. We looked at another island in the Pacific, and then we embarked upon Africa because I think we were talking to different anthropologists and looking at different people who worked in different parts of the world, and it seemed that going to Africa and certainly looking at the Himba people was a good option. Clearly, there were certain things that would rule certain places out. For instance, we obviously didn't want anything that felt anything like, we were never going to get a first contact tribe. There was never the intention, but we didn't even want anything that approached a first contact tribe, i.e. we wanted a tribe or a village that had sort of limited but sustained contact with the West, right? So we weren't going to come along and sort of come completely out of the blue, but we would, but at the same time, they weren't so accustomed to what we do in the West that none of this would come as a surprise. And we also, for instance, we couldn't go to places that were really hard to get to. I know Channel 4 made a series featuring some pygmies early last year, the Renegade made, I think, and I think that involved like 5 days travel from within country to get to that. And that would have been impossible for us. So certain places are out the moon. Anyway, we then locked down on Namibia through part of that refining process. And then we sent a producer out, a producer called Minna, who went out to Namibia, and she had fixers and people local to Namibia, very well versed in the indigenous people who filmed with them before. And they just drove them to these different villages. These villages are not on maps. They're not known. You would never find them, Donna. You know, none of us would find them. They're sort of, so these are places that are only known to people who work with those indigenous people. And we work with regional elders first, who are located in the village and might speak to, and then we'd go along and meet them and talk to them and see if they might be interested. And when they express they might be interested, that's when we then followed up with Dominique, who's the exec producer, going along and having further conversations.
I know you showed the films, didn't you? Once they were complete, you went back and showed them to the tribe. What did they think when they watched it back?
Well, it was an interesting response, actually. I mean, obviously, we didn't translate back the English into Himba effectively, because that was sort of beyond our capabilities, really. But what we did was we thought we just thought we could just go and show them. It'd be fun to do. So our local fixer and co-producer, Joel, he drove up there with a laptop. The whole village sort of piled into one of the huts, and as many as people could fit in, and real excitement. And what was quite funny, actually, what was quite interesting, was there were a couple of scenes. It was quite a sensitive thing within the edit, because there were scenes in which some of the villagers were coming in the house, for instance, and they were reacting to a lot of the things in the house in a way. I suppose when we first envisioned the series, I thought that could be quite interesting. Actually, when we got to the edit, we thought, there's a danger of, by showing too much of that, or even just a tiny bit too much of that, that it starts to feel in some way patronizing. And that was never what we wanted to do, because it actually sort of always felt that the series, the joke, if anything, or the comments were always, it was more about a ability to sort of look at our lives through the experience of being with him people. Anyway, the thing was, one of those scenes was a scene where 3 young women from the village had come in, and Scarlett had said right from the beginning, Scarlett Moffat in the programme, will they know how to climb stairs? And I was saying, of course they know how to climb stairs, Scarlett. That's ridiculous. You know, they haven't just been, you know, and of course, actually, when they came to the house, they don't obviously deal with stairs, they don't have stairs. So they were quite scared by them, and they didn't know how to walk up them. And Scarlett was very sweet, sort of helping them to go up the stairs. When the scene came out, I think some people found it a little bit, we're laughing at them in a way. And I remember my wife watching and said, I don't know, Sanjay, I think have you got the right balance there? But funnily enough, when we showed it to the village, they were hysterical at that scene. They were laughing their heads off at it, all of them, teasing the young women and blah 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 blah. And they found it. So basically, I thought they loved the fact seeing themselves on screen, and they loved some of the moments within it. And most importantly, I suppose, that they always felt that this should be an ongoing relationship in some way between us and them. And I felt that they felt pleased that we'd come back to see them.
And in terms of ongoing relationship, what was the aftercare you set up and put in place?
The aftercare we have put up is that, so it's part of the anthropological thing, the anthropologist's advice. We have put in place strict protocols on how to deal with our impact, environmental and all the rest of it. So obviously not a single trace of the house was left in any way, shape or form. And that village, if you go back, as the Daily Mail, funnily enough, did 2 weeks later to look for, they must have ruined something. They spent a few days there and sent their chief reporter, and they could find nothing at all, because we left nothing. They would walk around and say, there must be some part of the house there, but we took every trace of us away. I always sort of felt that the only thing we should leave in that village would be the memory of us and nothing else, and that's hopefully what we achieved. In relation to the aftercare, one of the things we had was we had a post-production impact report. So we sent an independent anthropologist who was Namibian and local, and she worked with a British anthropologist without our sort of mediation to go, and she spent, I think, a couple of days up there with a range of different questions and assessments, in which she interviewed a number of villagers to find out in what way had we impacted. And I mean, look, the report was overwhelmingly incredibly positive about what we've done. And there were a couple of things, for instance, where by hiring local drivers, she pointed out that we had sort of inflated the rates of local drivers because we sort of thought, okay, well, fair enough, and that's a bad impound, we'll try and put that right. But it was very, very minimal that we did wrong. One of the other things we've done is if anyone watched the program would know, this is a community that has to walk, it's got no water supply nearby. It has to walk, the villagers have to walk for 2 hours each way to go and get water. So the women in the village have to walk 4 hours a day to go and get water. And one of the things we asked when we went there was, what would you like from us? And they said, look, we would like something that benefits the community, and a borehole would be great. So we basically provided it's quite a sophisticated process. You have to bring in drilling equipment, drill right down to sort of 30, 40 meters below. And it's really unpredictable. In fact, it took us a long time to find water, but we basically provided a borehole, which is incredibly high tech, solar paneling and all the rest of it, so that fundamentally they now have water supply minutes from their house, not hours from their houses. And that is something that we have committed to maintaining and paying the maintenance costs for at least the next 5 years. So in some small way, we hope that actually helps to alleviate the conditions in a village, but without it feeling like there's been a major intervention which changes things in the village.
Yeah, that makes total sense, Sanjay. You've mentioned the Mail looking for dirt. There was a bit of a backlash at TX, or before TX even, from another paper, and some criticism around the series. What would you say in reply to that?
I'd say watch the series. I mean, basically, I think there was, I think there was sort of some criticism from The Guardian and The Independent. I think the sort of middle-class liberal elites were a bit outraged by the very idea of what we were doing before they saw a frame of it. I can understand that, I can understand why people would think this is a controversial idea and why Channel 4 are doing it and so on. But I think that, and it was interesting actually, Donna, I know you and I spoke about this, but it was really interesting to watch what happened on Twitter on the night. But I was slightly dreading it because I thought, okay, we're just getting beaten up here. The papers had piled in a bit, and it was all a bit tough. And then what basically happened was that watching on Twitter, at first it started with before the program had started, like the minutes before, oh my God, I'm looking, what the hell are Channel 4 doing? What are they smoking at Horseferry Road to commission this show, blah, 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 what will be next? And then it sort of started, and it was like, I wonder what this is going to be like. And then it was very quickly, and I'm not talking about the odd comment, I'm talking about the bulk of comments. The vast majority suddenly became, quite like this show, it's really interesting. And then within about 10 minutes, it's like, I love this program. This is great. They're so warm and so emotional. So it's completely different to what I was expecting. And by the end, I'd say 99% of the tweets, you can't judge an entire program or the response program entirely by social media, but it is an indicator, were overwhelmingly positive. Same thing happened on newspaper comment sections. You see a newspaper run a really critical piece, and then the comments were incredibly positive, saying, one of the accusations was it was somehow a racist program, and I just couldn't, for the life of me, can't understand how anyone can make that accusation. I just don't see it at all. Maybe I'm being too defensive. I've never seen it. I've never had anyone explain it to me properly. And all I ever say to people is we're critical, and that criticism, by the way, died down instantly. It was there in a storm for a couple of days, and then it just disappeared. And I think it disappeared because people understood what we were trying to do. It was not being a white family is going in a colonialist way to Africa to make comments about a black family and the way they live. It was actually about, here are two families, two ways of living that hold a mirror to each other and see what we can learn from each other's way of life in a way that otherwise can't be achieved. And ultimately, it was built entirely around human relationships and bonds, rather than sending in an expert anthropologist to go and judge people and interpret their actions for us, which I think is more patronizing, actually. And I think it was fundamentally built around human friendships, people becoming friends and learning from each other in the process. And I think it was full of heart and warmth and love and humor, and it had learning for us all within it. And I think as people watch more and more of the series, I think they got that. So in answer to your question, if people are critical of the program, I'd say watch the show And if you still don't change your mind, I don't think you're ever going to change your mind because you prejudged it. But I haven't had, no one's really debated with me on the issue, maybe because they realise I get very annoyed very quickly about the subject. But I'd love to hear it. I mean, I'd love to hear it. If people are here, you've got criticism, tell me.
Yeah. And there's just two more questions I'm going to take. Why Scarlett Moffat? What was behind the casting process? How easy was it to come to that decision?
Scarlett Moffat was almost instantaneous. We didn't start, fun enough, thinking it would be a well-known family. We thought it'd just be an ordinary family. And then we thought, actually, given it's an expensive and hard show to make and all those things, and by the way, I should just say, within the realms of the overall thing about this programme, it fit that same thing as Plane Crash. It was like, okay, no one at Channel 4, everyone at Channel 4 was like, how are you actually going to be able to pull this off? We don't forget, Donna, this was building a house in the middle of nowhere that had no utilities, no supply, that had everything from Netflix to hot running water to washing machines to Wi-Fi, and shipping over 22,000 household items, have a fully functioning Western house in the middle of a desert, right? So it was no mean achievement to pull that off. But Scarlett Moffat, we just felt her family read like a family. They didn't necessarily read like a bunch of celebrities because they'd come to prominence through Gogwatch. They weren't comedians, but they were engaging and funny and warm. So I think as soon as we hit upon the idea of Scarlett, we knew if she would do it, she was the one.
And final question here. Hopefully there'll be a second series. What would you change for series 2? What were your key learnings and what would you change for a series 2?
That's a good question. Well, I mean, editorially, certain things I would look at. If you're asking me what would I change in terms of have I learned anything from the backlash that there was amongst the Guardian Independent, probably not much. We won an RTS for it 2 weeks ago, which isn't bad going for for a program. I think it got some critical acclaim. I think it's been recognised by the industry, and I think incidentally, it was the highest unscripted launch on Channel 4 last year. So I think it was watched by many millions of viewers. It was loved by people, and it was recognised by the industry. So I'm not trying to blow on trumpets, I'm probably being a bit too defensive, but I sort of think. But of course, like everyone, I'll always see faults in programmes, and I kind of think. What would I change? I'll tell you what I would change. I probably would feel, and this is what we're in conversation with Channel 4 about as well, is I'd like to feel that we could foreground a bit more of the environmental questions and concerns that are particularly relevant to these people's lives. Like, it really struck me when we were there that actually our actions in the West, where we are, our actions that lead to global warming, I'm not really seeing properly an in-depth examination of how that affects other people. You see how it affects wildlife and sea levels, and also, but this has a day-to-day impact on the lives of entire swathes of Indigenous people in a kind of incredibly destructive way. And I spent a fair bit of time in Namibia, both during the shoot and afterwards, and I was really aware. I went back to Namibia for a holiday actually in Christmas, and it started raining. And people out in the streets, they were crying because it was raining, because the water had finally come. And so I sort of think what I would probably do is foreground more the environmental issues that Indigenous people face as part of the storytelling.
Brilliant. Now, I'm just going to take the last sort of 5-10 minutes to talk about your career trajectory. There's a great question on here that said, what is Sanjay's career journey that allowed him to be entrusted with the most expensive doc in history? So we'll go on and talk about that. So what were the key moments and the key decisions or the strategy you took for your career, or was it all luck, judgment, timing? I
don't know, really, Donna. I think there's a bit of the fake it till you make it a bit in places, definitely. I think the key things for me would just be like, without boring everyone to death, I hate these answers really, but without boring everyone to death, it's, I started in news. I started as a trainee in BBC News, and then I stayed there for quite a long time, and I was on Newsnight, and then I was the BBC's Washington producer for a couple of years, and after that, 9/11 was the last sort of story we covered there. I sort of felt, I'd seen the news cycle repeat, and I was bored by it, and I was bored by the lack of creativity involved there. And at that stage, John, I came and worked with you. I managed to get a transfer across to Popular Factual and started working in development. And then Donna, you were kind enough to give me a break as a series producer, which was quite a risk. And I suppose the thing is, that's what I've sort of found really, and I hope I try to do with some of the people I work with. So I think that there are definite points in my life where I've had somebody who championed me, and someone who, not quite like a mentor, but somebody who had more hands-on power than a mentor, who could say, look, I trust you and we're going to give you this opportunity. You were one of those people, Donna, actually. I'm just saying actually here, I would say that behind your back. And there have been others, like Karen O'Connor was one of those people when she was at Newsnight. And there have been others before and since. And I think it's really important for people to sort of, I think people in positions of authority, I think you should understand what you can do for people by giving them some responsibility, taking a bit of a risk with people and backing them, supporting them to do it, because I've benefited from that. And I think people who are in the position, who are now in the position I was in, seize it. You know, if you can find those people, really important to maintain those relationships, and really important, I think, when the moment comes, to just grab hold, just take it. You know, just don't have the, I mean, I don't know, I'm not really answering this question very well. I just say that I had certain opportunities given to me. I seized them when I could. I didn't try to push too hard. I never really chased promotion very much. But I moved around a lot, and that was, I think, the key thing. I moved from the BBC, I moved from film to documentaries to science to news. I've tried to do a bit of everything, and I think there's something about doing a bit of everything which makes you feel you lose the fear of TV. I'm not afraid of television anymore, because I think I've done so many different types of it. I don't think there's a project you could give me now that I'd be worried about taking on.
And there's quite a few comments on here. Are you open to freelancers bringing you ideas?
I'm open to everyone bringing me ideas. I think always in the search for ideas, and I don't remotely feel that we have a monopoly within our development team or to come up with them. I think the challenge is that it's quite hard to come up with conceptual ideas, because unless you're plugged into the day-to-day conversations with commissioning editors, what may feel like a good idea as a freelancer might not fit what the channels are currently sort of looking for. Do you see what I mean? But whereas I think particularly freelancers can be really good is they're out and about meeting people and going to places and locations where you might be able to say, here's a great place to access, you know, here's a great story you could tell, and I've been there, or here's a great person, I don't know what we do with them, but I think they're a brilliant character. So I think I'm particularly alive to that sort of idea, which is access-based, people-based, rather than, oh, here's a new Fat 10 format for you, which from my experience, I'm happy to prove on my experiences, that's not what tends to happen from freelancers. But when they come in and say, have you thought about this place? I live there, or I've been there. That's why I'm more interested in knowing about.
Brilliant. And this is penultimate question from me. There's a lovely comment on here that somebody says they worked at Voltage and hands up the best company they've ever worked for. But obviously there's a growing movement now, you know, kind of this shitstorm has hit freelancers incredibly hard. And yes, you have a great company and have a great team, but our industry is built on the expertise, creativity, goodwill of our freelancers, who sort of, when it happens, can be booted out with nothing. How do we change our industry, and how do we change our relationship with freelancers?
Oh, that's a big question there, Donna. I think, look, in a very, very short space of time, I don't have all the answers to that. All I'd say is, I think there's a short-term answer to that, and then there's a longer-term answer. I think in the short term, I think it's incumbent upon companies, all of us, to try to do what we can. And so therefore at Voltage, what we've tried to do is we have had to stand some freelancers down because projects were just basically cancelled. We had 5 series that were in production that have basically been pulled. Hopefully they'll come back, they may not. And obviously if there isn't the work for people, but we always gave people notice. And what we've always tried to do is say, with other productions that are still going on but they're delayed, we're trying to keep people on part-time and say, okay, rather than lose you, we're just trying to elongate the pre-production schedule and hope that the production restrictions will lift so we can keep on going. we've also tried to say to other freelancers that we've had to sort of stand down, you're first in line. Therefore, if there's any other work we're going to get in, any development work, any bits of work, and we've been true to it, as long as you can broadly fit the criteria, you're going to be the first people we go to. So I think as companies at the moment, that's all we can do is make sure we prioritize doing that workload. I think other companies have taken the initiative of trying to, which I think has been a great thing, trying to lobby the government. It hasn't been successful particularly. I think it's devastating. It's absolutely devastating for the industry. There's so many freelancers are sitting there with no money coming in. I think so. In short term, all we can do is, I'm just saying to my teams, please, let's get ideas commissioned. It means we can keep more people in work and we can just funnel out some work to people. And I think it's a moral obligation we have at the moment just to keep money going to people's pockets so they can pay the rent. And as many people as we can do that with, we will continue to. Longer term, I think it's not a conversation for right now, Donna, because I think at the moment we're in crisis management. Longer term, I think there are very big questions about how do you make freelancers feel like there is a kind of someone looking after their long-term career trajectory. Yeah. And I know that, for instance, there was somebody, I speak to a senior accountancy firm. They say at this accountancy firm, very big accountancy firm, they ask for key partners there to maintain a relationship with all the freelancers that come through, so that they, even as they go through other firms, you've always got a link with someone at that company who's always keeping an eye on you. They offer up free training. That accountancy firm will say, even if you've left the company, you can access our training so you can keep up to speed with things. And I was like, those are all really, really good things. I think those are conversations, things that you're doing now, brilliant. More indie, probably, how do we try to take this on, Donna? You'll do this unpaid. You're not getting paid any money to do this now. It's a brilliant thing to do. And hats off to you for doing it, by the way. I think, how do we carry on what you've started here? And that's, I suppose, the lesson with all this coronavirus thing, isn't it? It's ultimately, how do we learn from the experiences we're developing here that we've had to put in place because of an emergency situation and learn from the best of it? This is a good example. Maybe we can all work out ways in which we can connect better with freelancers, train better with freelancers and mentor and look after them and watch for their long-term career trajectory.
I think that's a really good point and a good place to end. There's lots of lovely comments on here saying thank you for being so honest and open, and it's really inspiring. People really excited you've opened up in Bristol. Thank you, Sanjay, for your time. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and have a good rest of your day.